Sean Foley has come all the way from Australia. He's been waiting patiently. So without any further ado.
Great, so it's great to be here. This is my second time in India. I came to the conference a couple of years ago, and it's always a pleasure to be here. So, yeah, sure. So it's okay. So one of the things that we've become interested in is tick sizes in cryptocurrency markets. So I started doing a lot of research in this area, and I have a couple of PhD students who are working with this now. I can just shout back. So this is something that I actually found is quite relevant to India. So one of the problems or one of the issues that's interesting with tick sizes is in cryptocurrencies is that they're incredibly small. So we're talking like 10 to the negative 8. So we're using 8 decimal places. Even when Bitcoin was at 20,000 US dollars, this equated to like 1/100th or 1,000th of a cent. So very, very small. And this is something that's relevant to India, I found out, because, I'm sorry, I forgot, what's a cent called here? Pesak. So then your stock market doesn't have a rupee. For me, rupee is already quite a small unit of currency. But actually, we take it to Pesak, and we have 0.05, so 5 cents, 5 Pesak, 1/20th of is the tick size here, right? So then this is incredibly small in basis points. So I was really glad when I found this out. I'm like, I'm going to put that in the motivation for my paper because I was kind of struggling to find which other markets this is kind of applicable to. So we have this trade-off when we're looking at tick size, and obviously it's something that's become important for, it's kind of become a topic of debate with the US tick size pilot, and they're really going in another direction, right? They're saying, oh, maybe we take it 1 cent, we make it 5. Maybe bigger is better. But they found it's not, and it wasn't surprising to anyone. But you face this trade-off. So as I make tick sizes smaller, I have this potential to have very small spreads, to get quoted spreads down to some kind of minimum. But as I make the tick sizes smaller, you have to spread your liquidity or the depth across many more levels. So you have this kind of trade-off that as I aggregate, get larger and larger tick sizes, I get higher depth. Okay, so people are more willing to quote at those larger kind of price poles or those points. As I fragment it, at each level, I get much finer. I spread that liquidity out across a larger kind of surface area. It's like spreading some, when you dry your hands, you've got to move them to get the surface area to evaporate the water. So there's this trade-off around depth and costs. And so this is the kind of tension that we're trying to understand. So for example, you can see here, if I have a tick size 0.1 cents, the true spread is 2 cents. That means I have 20 ticks within which I can move. Okay? As I increase this, if I make the tick size 1 cent and the spread is 2 cents, then suddenly the spread is just 2 ticks. If I make the spread 5 cents, the minimum tick 5 cents, then it's binding. Okay? Then the constraint becomes binding, and the spread's going to move from 2 cents to 5, because that's the minimum that we allowed in the market. So what happens as I increase the relative tick size? Eventually it becomes binding, and the quoted spread is forced up. Okay, so as the tick size increases, the relative tick size increases, then I increase what is the minimum quoted spread. It moves down to the tick size itself. So this has the potential to increase the spreads. It will also increase the depth, and it can maybe improve liquidity provision. As I reduce spreads, I'm going to reduce that depth at the best, and maybe the sizes becomes important. So this is one side of the curve. However, on the other side, and this is something I found is very pertinent to the Indian market as well, as I give you a more and more granular, as I move towards a continuous pricing grid, then if I put my big order, I want to buy 1 million shares at some price point, then people can free ride on this information. I can just step in front of you, undercut you, by a very economically insignificant amount. I step in front of you by 10 to the negative 8. I step in front of you by 5 Pesak. I step in front just by this tiny, tiny bit. Now this is very annoying for me, right? Because now I'm posting my liquidity. I thought I'm at a good price, and then someone just goes, well, whatever, I'm just going to step in front of you. If I get executed and price moves down, it's going to hit you. I will sell back to you. If price goes up, I win. So it's kind of like a free riding option, okay? So this can actually cause problems, because if I now know that my limit order is going to get free rided on with something that is economically meaningless, it makes me disinclined to submit that order in the first place. I don't want to put large orders in the market because they're not going to get executed. So what's going to happen, I'm maybe forced to move more towards market orders. Okay, if I use a market order, I know I'm going to get executed, people can't free ride, fine, but I had to pay more. So you kind of discourage liquidity provision. And what this can actually do, as we move tick size closer to zero, this discouraging of liquidity provision can actually increase the quoted spread itself, not because of anything to do with the binding of the tick size, but because of this undercutting behavior. So here I have grabbed from one of my marketplaces some example of undercutting. So here you can see the price, 210, this is for Ethereum, $210 and 0.89799032. Somebody jumps in front, you can see all these digits are the same except 33. So they've stepped in front by an economically insignificant amount, right? I am paying more, but really it doesn't cost me anything, okay? What this means is that you basically break price time priority. So markets are structured on this idea that if I pay more than you, I get to go first. If not, we pay the same, we get in line. But if we break down this price time priority by creating this infinitely continuous grid, then we can get some issues coming through, okay? So here you can see an example of what's going on with undercutting. Somebody posts a big order, he removes it, posts a big order, removes it. Then you see somebody post in front, cancel, post in front, and just keep going, right? I just keep going tick, 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 tick in front of each other. You're kind of battling for the top of the book. So this is the kind of thing that we're observing in these markets. And from anecdotally talking to people about India, they say they experience this problem as well. So there's some theoretical literature that tells us, well, you kind of get these high waiting costs, okay? This can cause these traders to become impatient, to cross the spread, use the market orders, and ultimately, increase the costs, increase the spreads simply because you have too fine a grid. So all of the evidence that we have, all the empirical evidence, because financial markets typically have 1 cent tick sizes, or they have these kind of graduated tick sizes in Europe, for example, we're typically in this section of the world, okay? We're usually here, and what we've said is, okay, we go from, so, I guess some of this old literature, right, looks at, okay, we had odd eights, then we moved to 16ths, then we moved to decimalization, and at each point, we're finding it's beneficial because we're going from somewhere here on this curve, getting down towards some point. We never got to the point, for example, in the US, there's decimalization, it's 1 cent. We never got to the point where it's so low that this undercutting became an issue, okay? We have this nice little laboratory where we can look at something where the tick size is so small that we can observe this conduct. So we look at a cryptocurrency exchange called Kraken. Okay, they are trading many different cryptocurrencies, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, ETH Classic, and then they trade to USD as the fiat currency pair. Okay, so we look at a variety of these currency pairs because what we had. So I had to build a scraper to kind of go hit the exchanges every 500 milliseconds. I had to distribute it across different servers so they don't ban me. But I'm just hitting their market and collecting the order book data. So I've kind of built my own TAC database, if you like, for these cryptocurrency markets. And what was cool was whilst I was collecting this data, so this is in 2017, there was a change. Okay, so Kraken realized, they said, hey, this is putting a lot of load on our servers. Everybody jumping in front of each other causes high message traffic. They have to kind of deal with that message traffic. Also, they see this undercutting, and they're like, well, we want to try to eliminate this from our market. So what we're going to do, we're going to increase the tick size. So they increased by huge factors. Okay? So they did it in 2 stages. They did it 1 week and then the next week. So you can see previously the relative tick size was like basically 0. Okay? That tick size went from 0 more or less to about 2 basis points across all the currency pairs. So some of them jumped and jumped again, some jumped only once, but they significantly increased, right? We went from 10 to the -8 to 10 to the -2. So we went basically to about a cent. Okay? What this did is gives us this nice little experiment where we can see, well, how does traders' behavior change when undercutting is basically costless to when markets come back to looking more like equities markets, okay? So then we said, okay, I want to try to give you some sense of how comparable this is, just how different the scale is to the S&P 500. So I went and collected the S&P 500 and I plotted the relative tick size, okay, in basis points, so it's typically 1 cent in the US, the relative tick size compared to the quoted spread that they observed. Here you can see a nice indication of that shape, right? That as prices come down, the relative tick size goes up. Okay, this is where constraint is binding. You can see here this is 1 basis point. Okay, In the equities market, we get down maybe as far as 0.06. This is as low as the equities markets get in the US. It's for very high price stock, right? Berkshire Hathaway or something like that. I had to use a different scale, right? I cut it at one basis point here because in the pre-period, my currency pairs are so small in the relative tick size that I cannot even plot, to plot it, I really have to spread it out. Great. I have 5 minutes because Pradeep likes to talk. So we use the two-stage risk first estimator to try to understand how it's impacting the trader behavior. So what we found is that there are more limit orders. When we increase the tick size, there's more limit orders, and those limit orders are larger. People are more willing to expose their desire to trade, okay? And each trade that exists each market order goes through fewer price steps, okay? So we're seeing more clustering at the price points that we've constructed. It also leads to a reduction, even though these spreads are not constrained, we see a reduction in the cost of trading. So we see reductions in the quoted spreads, reductions in the effective spreads. We look at, does it matter if it's a big trade or a large trade? So we put a hypothetical shock through the market, $500 shock. Let's think about a retail trade. $200,000 shock. Let's think about an institutional trade. So we put these shocks through the market and see how much would you pay if you execute a small order or a large order at any point in time. And these costs come down as well. And we find that if you go some basis points out, total aggregate depth is increasing significantly. And we see reductions in volatility, okay? So we then wanted to say, okay, well, we have these sort of 6 to 10 currency pairs, and they all experienced a different size shift in the relative basis points that they're experiencing. So if we're going to see this kind of, I think I have it here, if we're going to see this kind of shape, we know about this side of the curve. We know a lot about this side, but we know very little about this side. So what I wanted to see is, do we actually observe this shape, that as we get even closer to zero, we push it back up? So look at those that have a smaller shock compared to those that have a larger shock. And lo and behold, those ones that have a much larger relative increase in the size of in the relative tick size, they have the most dramatic effects versus those that have smaller shocks. So that's it. I can do it justice in 10 minutes. Thanks very much, guys. If you have questions, you can email me.
Okay, hi everyone. So first of all, Sean, great presentation. And I think this was a little revised version of the paper that I got. So please, my comments are based on that, slightly with slight differences. Some of the things that I mentioned in my comments, you have incorporated already. Okay, so the paper, I will begin with a brief summary of what he has done and then provide some comments. I hope they turn out to be somewhat useful now that a lot has already been done. Quick summary, what the paper is trying to do is examine the impact of change in tick size, more specifically an increase in tick size with reference to a cryptocurrency exchange, which is like really, really new. And the advantage of going to a cryptocurrency exchange is we get to see very, very small relative tick sizes, which otherwise we do not see on equity markets. This thing Sean has already mentioned very well, and I think this takes us to another extreme, which we do not see so much in equity markets, but to a certain extent, we see it in the forex market. And therefore, the paper actually motivates the entire analysis by saying that, look, now we have this experimental setting, and probably the insights that we get out of this paper could be taken into the forex markets, right, which have not so well been studied. So that's the entire motivation in the paper, and as Sean said, that they analyze the Kraken exchange. Findings, they broadly find that it reduces undercutting, which is very good for liquidity providers. That's what needed, and that was also the underlying objective of the exchange itself, right? The second point they say is that, of course, it restores the relevance of time priority because now you cannot undercut, and therefore, if I posted my order before you and the spreads are not constrained, then I am better off, right? And the third one is that what I find interesting in this result is that this is the most contrary result against all the studies that have been on this subject so far, that it actually reduces quoted spreads because you expect that the tick size increment would actually lead to a certain increase in spreads. This is not the case as defined. Yeah. So as I said, it's a unique setting, extremely low relative tick sizes, unconstrained spreads, and with an asset which has almost zero fundamental value. We do not know what drives the value of the asset. It's primarily the order flow that's coming in, based on which people are trading, right? And limited participation. Now, even though we are saying that, yes, it can be, the findings of it can be replicated to Forex markets, but we know that the size of those markets is huge. And we have to worry about how many participants are actually in there in this market, and wonder whether the findings of this would actually be there in the Forex market if we implement something like this. Now, what's good about this paper is it provides a laboratory setting where you can analyze how traders interact when they are given this new constraint. And of course, as I said, there is a large body of literature. We do not know what happens to other findings. In terms of findings, I think it's broadly in agreement with the theoretical predictions, but what's most surprising is the improvement in liquidity or transaction costs that we find. Now, some of the questions that came to my mind when I started thinking about it was, I would look for more details. I was looking for more details in terms of composition of traders. The paper does say that there are a lot of algorithmic, the exchange accommodates algorithmic traders, but we do not know what's the percentage of it is there in that market. Now, why I say this could be important is that if there are a lot of algorithmic traders, and because time priority gets restored, is it now that speed overtakes and algorithmic traders become more active in this market, and the non-algorithmic traders get crowded out? So that kind of at least some sense, and because also that literature on HFT is now trying to analyze what is the interaction between HFT and non-HFT when in relation to relative tick sizes. The second question is, what was the tick size on competing exchanges? This is a major element that I find missing in the paper. You do say that after the increment, tick sizes are now in consonance with 2 other exchanges, but there are several exchanges that are trading this curve. And I think that would really help in order to understand where this exchange stands and what's the market share of this exchange. And that's also important because I want to understand whether liquidity providers from other exchanges started coming to this market after the increment. So that's another point that comes to mind. Third question, was this really an exogenous shock? Because in the circular, the exchange says that the traders have been requesting us to increase the trade size because they were facing a lot of undercutting. So, when you do this analysis, and with only an event window of 1 week before and 1 week after, I worry about whether you are seeing the effects that you are seeing are actually completely exogenous or related to this event or not. Yeah, and I was thinking in my mind, the exchange first changed the tick size on 31st August or 30th August, and then right after 1 week. Why? You need the market to stabilize and then understand the impact. So I really think that this paper needs a longer event window in order to make some strong statements. In terms of empirical strategy, I strongly feel that in order to isolate the impact, it would really help to get data from competing exchanges and then do the analysis what happened. That would be the best case scenario. Of course, I understand that you scrape this data and probably it would be difficult to go back in time unless you, so that's one issue. Else, this is one thing that I also was thinking, which you have almost done in the paper now, that is how for currency pairs which had large relative changes, tick size changes versus small, how does that behave? And I was little worried about the X's that you include in your regressions, like the volumes and the volatility and number of trades. There are strong endogeneity issues with liquidity variables and all these variables. So I would worry about that before including them into the regression. Instead, I would go for lagged returns just to capture the market mood. So yeah, these are minor comments. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions? Larry?
No questions, but just some interesting perspectives. When the ECNs, these were electronic communication networks, these were the first electronic exchanges came to the United States. There was this island archipelago and a few others. They all had extremely small tick sizes, and they probably did it because they were established by technologists who didn't know very much about market structure. After a while, as these systems became used more and more, the traders started complaining vociferously about what they called pennying, the ability for people to step in front for a millionth of a cent or something like that. And eventually the ECNs all decided to stop it because they needed to retain their traders. The fear was that one ECN stops it and that'll pick up all the traders. So I'm not personally familiar with the cryptocurrencies, but the story seems essentially identical. And I would note that I'll trace for you, though, the political dynamics of how these rule changes likely work. So when the crypto changes started out, there were basically two types of traders. There are the yo-yos who were trading these things because it was very exciting, the manual traders. There's tons of volatility. They're gambling. They've got visions of the future and how important these currencies are going to be. And then you had the electronic traders, basically high-frequency traders. And it didn't take them very long to get there. And when they arrived, they started playing basically two games, the game of leapfrog and also the other game, which was quote matching, which is the extraction of the value of standing limit orders. And the exchanges depended upon these high-frequency traders to make the markets very liquid. And more importantly, they sell data to the high-frequency traders. And so the trading rules reflect the needs of the high-frequency traders. And we see this in other more established markets as well, for instance, in the current equity markets throughout the world. At some point, though, as the yo-yos become a little bit more sophisticated and as more institutions get involved in the space, enough complaining comes up that they're going to cause the change in the tick size, and that's probably what happened. But the really interesting thing is how exchanges will cater to the traders who are well organized to get what they want when they're creating their trading rules. High-frequency traders knew exactly what they wanted and undoubtedly vociferously resisted these tick changes. But the exchanges had to change it because in the end, if they lose those, what I've been calling the yo-yos, the uninformed traders, then they won't do any trading at all because the high frequency won't trade with each other.
Any other questions, Pradeep?
A small point, which is the argument here about undercutting is a very good one, but it's really valid only for very small tick sizes. And so from the perspective of your paper, it's kind of very nice to be able to sort of broaden that to be able to see kind of what happens for larger tick sizes. So take another example where you say, well, this is where the tick size is comparable, if you like, and there. Now, in your design, clearly it's difficult to do, but it is essentially meant for very low tick sizes. Yeah.
Okay, Sean.
So thanks, Nidhi. That was a great discussion. And so yeah, we have looked at longer windows. So when the API goes down, we have the ability to look at the market stays up. So people who are interfacing, like the yo-yos who are clicking, they can still trade. But for this window of like 6 or 8 hours, 1 week before the changes, or a few days before the changes come in, the HFT guys are gone. So I think it's we can potentially utilize this to get a handle on how much HFT activity is actually in these markets, because we can see, for example, how trades and volumes adjust in that period when it switches off, just randomly, right? The API just goes down, and when it comes back on. So I think that's a great suggestion, and we'll try to incorporate it in the future. Thanks very much.